Let's talk about the modeling process. So we've seen models, and we've talked about some general features of agent-based models. I'd like to speak about the process in which this takes place. It's important to think explicitly about the processes by which these models are built, because it importantly shapes what's in the models and how they can be used. And it's also important for developing best practices within this area. So modeling processes in health for agent-based models are often conducted within an interdisciplinary team, and it's typically an ongoing process of learning and refinement. And I want to highlight that. There's learning all through the process, typically. It's not just at the end when you come out with your nice new big, shiny model after 2 years. Hopefully it's something which is occurring all throughout the process. You're learning from running the model, and that shapes your understanding of priorities, and it shapes your understanding of what the most promising uses of this model are. And ideally, it's conducted in a context where we can model, where we can put in place implementations that implement strategies that come out of the modeling and observe the results, and where we can shape the data collection using understanding gathered by the modeling. It's not always we have that luxury, but it's ideal when we do. Traditionally, the focus in the agent-based modeling literature has been on insights from the model delivered at the end of the process. But I feel, from my own background, which has been substantially sort of informed by system dynamics community as well, that it's often the modeling process itself, rather than just the models that are generated that yield the greatest value. In other words, even if you were to lose your model through some horrible hard disk crash, you were to lose your model at the end of building it up, I would argue that often you have gained significant assets in the form of how you're sharpening your thinking about how the system works. And you'd probably be able to build that model again much more quickly and with much more clarity than you did the first time. It's helping to shape your mental model, in other words. This is a controversial issue in agent-based modeling. There's some agent-based models that I've met who will assiduously disavow any interest in shaping people's mental models. I happen to believe it's central to the modeling process if you really want to get the recommendations of the model put into practice. If you're interested in doing more than sort of contributing interesting intellectual tidbits to the discourse related to these interventions, if you're actually interested in making a difference, often shifting mental models of the modeling team and other stakeholders is central to having an effect. So the modeling process consists of a variety of steps, and we're not going to have time to go into them. You can find lectures of me online detailing these steps in much more significance in lectures that span several different recordings. But I'm just going to be highlighting a few salient aspects that we will need in the course of this week. But broadly, I want to note that it proceeds from an area that's more qualitative on the left here, from where we're trying to grapple with what goes in the model and what features of the situation we're trying to capture. We're trying to set the model scope and boundary. And it proceeds in a direction of quantitative models, which require more time, more insight and understanding to inform them, and often more data to ground them if we're interested in rigorously understanding the quantitative output of the model. It's also a highly iterative process. It's iterative at different levels. It's iterative at a minor level, since we're adding things into the model and going through multiple of these steps. And it's iterative in the sense that often we'll engage in later steps and come back to earlier. For example, we'll conceptualize the model, we'll map it out visually, maybe drawing state charts, maybe drawing causal loop diagrams, maybe drawing agent interaction diagrams, saying this agent sends messages to this other agent or presents for care at this clinician agent. So we try to map out qualitatively what's going on in the model, and then we try to formulate the model in a highly quantitative way. We're putting in direct assumptions about parameter values and about exactly in what way, say, care-seeking behavior takes place, what triggers it, and what are the likelihoods based on a person's health status, etc. Now, following model formulation, there's often a process of model calibration where you're trying to match that model you've created up with other data that you haven't built into the model in any way. It can't be put directly into the model. It doesn't relate to any one parameter, but to which the model you want the model to remain true. So in other words, you're trying to match the model up with data you have about the emergent behaviors you see in the real world, and you want the model to remain true to those, to be consistent with them, to have face validity. So here we're adjusting model assumptions to match real-world data. And sometimes what happens is it doesn't jibe. Often it doesn't jibe. We go to calibration step and it just doesn't add up. This model can't be effectively matched against this real-world data. And then we go back to these earlier stages. Then we sort of go and reconsider what's in our model, what the boundary is, reformulate some components, say, if we tried it this way, we assume that we would capture, say, infectiousness in as a single category, but people become successively more infectious over time, so maybe we should disaggregate it. Or for TB, maybe we have one state associated with active TB, and we say, well, we really need uninfected active TB, uninfectious active TB, and infectious active TB as two different states. So we might go back, and then we come back to model calibration. We find it's a suitable fit. There's a variety of steps of model testing, which involve everything from unit testing to sort of testing a model with extreme values, and cross-validating the model against data that we have, to which we have recourse, but which we didn't use in earlier stages of the process. We didn't use to put into the model. We didn't presuppose in the model, but instead we want the model to predict it, to match it. Having passed through a set of these stages, we may have a model that we think is worthy of using to give insights for possible policy comparisons, and we'll use it for evaluation, comparison of different intervention strategies, and then potentially for knowledge translation, for communicating with others in our stakeholder group more broadly. So this is our modeling process. Any questions? I will try to return to some aspects of this later, but it's a little bit ethereal now. It's a little bit abstract, and I'd like to ground you in actual experience with agent-based models before we go and discuss these. We're going to have whole lectures on some aspects of testing and model calibration. We're going to be discussing a lot model formulation. But are there any questions about the overall context here? Right now? People would like to ask? Okay. So I'd like to, then with your leave, I'd like to go into certain particular aspects that I want to emphasize for this week. Very, very important. One is the issue of incremental model development. If there's a single recommendation that can come out of this boot camp, a single thing I could leave you with when you go back home and you continue developing your models, it's this. When you build up an agent-based model, one of their greatest strengths and their greatest weaknesses is their flexibility. Strength, because you can represent at a highly articulated, fine-grained level a wide variety of processes related to evolution of health status, to care-seeking behavior, encounters with the healthcare system. You can really capture things at a very, very rich level. Those aspects of learning and situated context and aspects of heterogeneity. You can have an incredibly rich, precise model that affords you a chance to investigate detailed interventions. It's very powerful. That flexibility can be a key asset. Why is it a danger? It's a danger because all too often what happens is we throw the kitchen sink into these models. We think we're going to have the bigger, better model, and we set our eyes on it. 2 years from now, we're going to have a model that's going to have all these features, and it's going to give great insights. And I spent 2 years building it up, and often 2 years stretches to 4 years. And, time passes, your kids grow up, empires rise and crumble, and your model is still being developed. Oh, it's going to be great when it comes about. By the time it comes about, it's obsolete. The intervention is being considered or old hat, and someone who uses incremental model development has scooped you. That's a recipe for it's dangerous. It's dangerous at the level of planning your schedule. It's dangerous at the level of keeping your stakeholder confidence. It's dangerous at the level of coming out with a model in which you have any degree of confidence. What's much more effective is a strategy of incremental model development. So this is a strategy which builds up a model piece by piece by piece in a step-by-step fashion. And with each iteration, the model is modified in some small fashion, and you observe the implications of that small change in terms of model behavior. How did it change things? How did adding that piece in change things? Why is this so important? Well, it's important at a couple different levels. Level one, it's important for knowing that if you did something silly, and we all do, you will catch it as soon as possible. You'll be able to compare that with your previous version and say, wow, that's weird behavior. Is that really real? And then you discover you told it to do something you didn't mean to. Computers are very, very good at doing exactly what you've told them to do. Exactly what you've told them to do. Sometimes what you've told them to do is not what you wanted to tell them to do. And if you compare the new one with the old one, you'll be able to find that problem sooner. You'll see that strange behavior sooner, and you'll be able to track it down because you've only changed one or two things. You'll be able to track it down, and you'll be able to find the problem. So if you want to have confidence you've not only built the right model, but built the model right, this is key. And folks like Dylan, who's one of the TAs here, will testify that this sort of incremental approach is central to developing any sort of significant program in a reliable fashion. But that's not the only thing. It's not only about finding your mistakes, although that's really important. Another is in making sense of why you see the behavior of the model. I could tell you a number of examples of cases where people have built up models and they have lots of things in it. Maybe it took longer than they expected, but they finally got to that point where lots of richness in that model. Good. And they went to run it. Wow, that's interesting behavior. Okay, now what? That's a really interesting behavior. Where's it coming from? Well, it's coming from all these parts. Okay, well, which part is driving which part of that behavior? I don't know. It's coming from all of them interacting. Well, that only gets you so far. And you can go, once you have that model, you can go through very careful experimentation, through very careful controlled experimentation. You can tease it out, which part is driving what, and we do that a lot. But it's much more easily done if, while building up the model, you observe the effect of adding that and say, wow, that is really interesting. If you check, oh, it seems to be grounded. I didn't make a mistake. And now you've known that particular thing you added, that led to this big change. And that's really useful. It's really useful for understanding the implication of that change and where the behavior you're finally going to see in your model down the road is going to be coming from. It helps you realize, be able to explain the model results in a very salient fashion. So that's another motivation. But those aren't all the motivations. You will further have motivations associated with adding things in incrementally to model to keep your stakeholders engaged. You're going to have results all through the model. You're going to be able to be getting insights from this model from the start, and you're going to be able to talk with people about it and get their feedback on it. And from that, they're more likely to remain confident about the model. If you think it's going to take 2 years and it instead takes 4 years, they may have disengaged by that point. If you can keep them by building up that model incrementally, it helps to keep them engaged all through and develop their confidence. But perhaps most importantly, all these are compelling reasons. Perhaps most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, it's important for learning in a way that shapes what model you produce. You may develop a model 2 years from now that has lots of great, rich heterogeneity, lots of features in it, lots of processes captured. It's a very nice match to your real-world situation. Maybe you end up with that 2 years from now. Fantastic. But the model you end up 2 years from now will be much more informed, much more educated, much more likely to be insightful if you've built it up incrementally, because you're learning all through the process. And when you first encounter, by adding these features in, you first see the behavior, that may shift you off in a different direction. You never knew that this one thing could have such a big difference, that it could lead to this really interesting behavior. And you keep on adding things in, you learn, and you end up with a model 2 years from now that's much more informed, compared to a model that you sat back and anticipated having 2 years from now, but really wasn't informed from the understanding along the way. So that adaptive nature of the process is of key significance. So incremental model development, building it up step by step, important for model correctness, important for stakeholder confidence, important for understanding model output, and important, finally, for learning all through the process in a way that informs where you eventually end up. The biggest recommendation that I can give in the course of this project, in the course of this boot camp. Sure. Yeah.
I was curious how you do this mechanically.
Okay.
When you dock your models to one another,
Yeah.
do you have separate copies of the model,
yeah.
or do you use version
yeah.
control? How do you actually do this?
So this is part of a discussion for later in the week, but briefly, we maintain multiple versions of the model. Preferentially, they're maintained in version control. At the least, they're maintained as separate versions on your computer. And there you can, run it in the previous version and run it in the current version and see the results. And that allows you to compare them side by side, essentially. Now, another feature of it, though, this docking was first described, I think, in Axtell and Axelrod's book. It was an essay in Axelrod's book, Evolution of Cooperation, I think. No, it's a later book, but it's one of the books in the background list. And this docking, what they actually recommend is, so first run the model with the new feature, but with it disabled. So just make sure you haven't broken anything, that you're going to get the same behavior out, and then enable it. And sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. But that docking does put a need on having previous versions of the model, and I think it's the best practice. Having previous versions of the model is key for reproducibility. And Priesri here, who's is in the back or somewhere in the area, she actually has a tool which every time you run a model in AnyLogic, it will save away the version of the model that was used for that particular run, which is very useful for being able to go back and reproduce it later and having a full kind of history of runs you've done with the model. So that could be a very potent tool for this process. Is that helpful? Yeah. George?
May come up later, but when you're trying to build a model and deciding on the probabilities of things happening
Yeah.
to drive the transition, if you have real data,
Yeah.
are you better off sort of aggregating and figuring out what the right number is and then building stochasticity around that in the agent-based model, or is there a way to actually connect to the real-world data set?
Oh, yeah.
To drive that randomness or that real-world.
Okay. So I think that the question was if you have real-world data and you want it to and you're interested in making sure that the model is consistent with that data, is there a way to sort of bring the two together in some way that you could either have that data drive pieces of the model, or you could have the model somehow be compared in an ongoing way against that data?
Well, I guess I was thinking about it, just the initial building of the model.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Probability of going to transition out of transition.
Oh, okay.
And I've got a real probability distribution
Sure.
from my data set.
Yep. We could impose that, and I'll be showing you exactly how you impose that probably later today. Okay? And there'll be a significant discussion of how we bring together models and output data 2 places in this boot camp, in addition to the various project work that we're going to be doing. One of them will be in a discussion of calibration, where we'll be discussing about matching the model output to real-world output. But another will be in discussion of data input and output for the model, how the model can actually bring data in from, say, a database or from a file and use it to create a population with certain characteristics, or use it to dictate how many people should be coming into the model at a given point in time or something like that. And similarly, for getting data out of the model that might be compared against real-world data, we'll have discussions on how you do that. And a lot of those mechanisms are declarative in any logic and can be used to good effect. Okay? So any questions about that? Okay, so let me make a few other points. There's some very nice frameworks. Different agent-based models will use different frameworks for specifying a model. When you first go to describe a model and describe its pieces, one of the popular frameworks is ODD, and there's this ODD plus variant that's been introduced that further enriches it. Another framework is the so-called Party framework taught by Ross Hammond as part of his teaching. And you might want to take a look at those, because often, at the least, they're really useful for making you think consciously about choices in your model. Okay, another issue, though, I want to touch on is this whole issue of the model scoping, this sort of problem conceptualization phase, this very first phase, and it relates to what I've just talked about earlier. Models are like maps, ladies and gentlemen. Many of you are new to Saskatoon, and if you wanted to make your way around the city, you'd look for a map. But the map you'd look for would be a map that meets your particular needs. Maybe it's a walking trails map. There's some wonderful walking trails down by the river there, and maybe you're in ways you could walk from the park town over to the university. And there's a variety of trails, and you use a walking map. If you wanted to drive across town, you'd use a street map. There's bus maps associated with town. Engineers who maintain our city's water infrastructure and deal with flooding are interested in topological, hydrological maps of the city. Models are like maps. They're fit to purpose. The only perfect map of the world is the world itself. We don't look to every map, say a street map, to have every detail of every blade of grass in the city. And neither should we look to models to have a perfect representation of reality. The only perfect model in terms of this representation of reality is the world itself. And it will take a long time to build that model. Like maybe, 4 billion years or whatever it is. So models are specific to purpose. And one of the real challenges of models is finding the right scope for your model. And one of the best things you can do is to use a statement of the research questions or the problem you're trying to investigate as a logical scalpel, a logical knife to cut away unnecessary complexity. So establishing a purpose of the model. Are you trying to explain some quantitative data? Are you trying to understand sort of broad trade-offs between where to intervene in a system? Are you trying to understand the very detailed trade-offs between different policies, how you intervene? These will all shape sort of what goes in your model over time. And I mentioned earlier, it's the flexibility of ABM that you have to watch out for here. So the issue is that in ABM, there's often a high opportunity cost to investing in a given model area. You put your effort into one area, it takes your efforts away from another area. And given that it's so flexible, and yet there's this cost, it's really important to wield this logical knife of model purpose. And there's this phrase we use in software engineering called the Yagni principle. You ain't gonna need it. Meaning, you don't put things in unless there's an absolutely compelling need, unless this is like the next thing that you're going to be examining. Don't sprinkle things in speculatively, because you may end up with a model that has tremendous number of sprinkles of unnecessary things over time. A key step in this process is considering explicitly the causal pathways. While our interest may predominantly lie with certain observables, certain things on which we have data. What we're really interested in here is what are the underlying processes that drive those outcomes we've noted. So we may have data, for example, on incident case counts for some infectious disease, or on the number of individuals dying from heart disease over time, or data on the prevalence of obesity within our population, data on the level of air pollution in certain regions of our city, and the number of asthma cases associated with that. But if we really want to understand what we're trying to do with the model is to capture a theory that explains a lot of these features, that describes the underlying processes that give rise in a way to it. And if we're thinking about something like obesity, we're thinking about the impact of housing voucher interventions, interventions which move people from a low-income neighborhood to a mixed-income neighborhood, and we're thinking about their impact on people's health status, say in terms of obesity, but also in terms of related things to health, such as crime involvement and graduation rates, an important factor for later life earnings and health trajectories. If we want to understand these things, we may have data on these particular factors, but we need to reason in our model about the various causal pathways. The fact that a given intervention, like a housing intervention, may impact obesity, say, through impacting availability of grocery stores rather than convenience stores. Maybe they go from a food desert to an area with better food environment, and that impacts their healthiness of diet, leads to a change of BMI and therefore obesity levels. But it could also be the same intervention impacts a variety of other things germane to obesity, other pathways such as perceived safety, leading to changes in sedentary behavior as well as physical activity, rippling through to obesity levels, neighborhood walkability, which may also change things. And finally, it may change social networks. And researchers in this area have hypothesized that one of the impacts of such interventions is by getting families to spend more time at home and eating together, which affects time spent at home, potentially sedentary behavior, healthiness of diet, and obesity levels. So if we're interested in a model that helps us understand these effects, we need a model that captures these often latent factors, sometimes factors that are difficult to observe directly, in a way that will help us understand if we change things upstream here on the left-hand side, how will it ripple through to these downstream factors? We're trying to sort of describe a theory as to how things work that will allow us to ask novel what-if questions, questions where there's little statistical data to guide our understanding of the outcomes, where perhaps new interventions are being put together in a novel portfolio, and we want to understand the outcomes in terms of measures of interest. So here, within our models, we're often spending a lot of time in these interactions over here. And in a context of agent-based modeling, often these pathways are associated with delays, nonlinearities, feedbacks, cases where a change in someone's obesity, a change in obesity for part of a population leads to change in norms as to levels of target weights and change in health-seeking behavior and BMI for the balance of the population, which further changes obesity. So you get these feedbacks involved as well that are often important features of this situation. Similarly, if we were interested in interventions, in this case from a study for China where we had formulated a proposal, here we're interested in understanding outcomes in terms of diabetes for various interventions. We have to think about the various causal pathways that mediate that and the ways in which these linkages to each other play out over time. So within our models, we're often thinking about these factors related to our research questions. The vision that I'd encourage you all to start thinking about for your models has been most explicitly articulated within the system dynamics community, and that is to distinguish in your models between three types of variables. things that are endogenous, that you're seeking the model to calculate, you're seeking the model to produce them, you're seeking the model to generate them over time. So this might be the number of infected people, for example, in that initial model. But there's also factors that are exogenous. We represent them in the model. They're captured in the model, but they're captured in a presupposed way, a way that, that is built into the model. They may be captured as constants or as fixed time series that we specify over time. We want the duration of infection to change in this way or what have you. So these are exogenous factors. Like endogenous, they're represented in our model, but they are represented in a way where the model doesn't produce them, but where it instead uses them as part of its calculations. And finally, there's a set of things that are ignored or excluded from our model. We have consciously put them aside with no shame attached because they're not yet going to go into this version of our model. Okay? These are factors that often we will then later start including either as exogenous or endogenous factors, but which we explicitly put aside initially. Things that lie outside the boundary of the model. This is a very common division. I would encourage those of you who are planning to pursue projects in the course of the week to try sketching out where things in your model are going to go for the first version of your model, and then evolve this over time, because this will be evolving over time as your model boundary changes. Yes, Ron?
Okay, now with your move from low income to mixed income neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
One of the things you have is risk of participation in criminal activities.
Right.
Now, are you assuming then, because in this mixed neighborhood, that this reduction isn't going to affect the overall level of background criminal activity because it's a relatively safe neighborhood anyway? Or is that something where you could have it as a fixed exogenous variable, or would you actually think about having it as a feedback? Because as the risk goes up, then perceived safety is going to go up, which has
Right. Indeed. It's a good question. In this case, the outcomes for the Observed Studies Moving to Opportunity program were mixed with respect to the outcome associated. For girls, this was affected in a positive, in a favorable direction. But for boys, it was actually adverse. So for boys, one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons people are so interested in these sort of causal pathways and understanding their dynamics, is because moving to opportunity seemed to have very materially helped girls with respect to obesity levels, high school graduation rates, and lower risk of involvement. But for boys, it had sort of washout effects for the other two, and this one, involvement in criminal activity, actually went up.
This could then have negative feedback.
Indeed.
Not just the local rate of going.
Indeed. Wow. So, it's a very good question about the role of feedbacks here. The way I've drawn this, I've emphasized the causal pathways here. Often, early on in a modeling project, what we'll be doing is sketching out causal loop diagrams. And, these are familiar from system dynamics for some of you. But come on, don't I have one in here to show? Wow. I have a lot in here, but, come on. Okay. Alas, a lot of other nice diagrams. This is something that integrates together causal loop diagram with stock and flow model. But for model mapping, what we'd often do is map out the feedbacks involved in this. So we'd explicitly create a diagram where there'd be feedbacks back. For example, risk of participation in criminal activity might further affect perceived safety, right? So there'd be a feedback associated with that. Here I did this in part because I find that often in these introductory remarks on the model process, often those coming to modeling projects in ABM, they're really focused on the data that they have to bear. So they have all this data and they want to make sense of it. My point here is that you need to reason about the causal pathways. You need to reason about the causal underpinnings, and those include feedbacks. They often include representation of delays, so there's very different delays here. And often there's going to be nonlinear factors involved in the sense of, you're going to have a situation where small change, for example, in neighborhood walkability may lead to a sizable change in sedentary behavior. And that may be different for different, at a certain point in neighborhood walkability, it may be almost a tipping point associated with that change.
So,
Yeah.
then it sounds
Yep.
like a reasonable starting place would be to say, this is where you're terminating as far as you're looking for change in criminal activity.
Right.
Now, at that point, would you and your stakeholders be working together and say, look, we have these interesting findings for males, which may have some feedback effects, so.
Then we might consider adding then.
But that's a reasonable starting place.
Correct. So if I were to start with a model sort of in this area, I would start with essentially one causal pathway associated with a simple story. And the point here is that models are like maps. They exist for all sorts of different purposes, all sorts of different levels of takeaway from them. And some models are seeking more for insight, and some models are more for quantitative comparison with some particular real world scenario. Models for insight will often be fairly stylized. They're thinking tools. They help us think through a situation based on a caricature of the situation. We have a situation we're trying to reason through what are the implications. If it were this way, what would the implications of that be? We're not trying to depict downtown Toronto. We're not trying to depict, the segregation in Detroit or the different boroughs of New York. Instead, what we're trying to do is we're trying to depict sort of one alternative theory about the world. It might not be a theory we believe obtains, but it's a simplified sort of stylized version of if things work this way in the world, what would the implication be in terms of the things we care about? And that might help us explain phenomena which we see. It might help us make sense of what is needed in our model. And so often I would start with a single pathway in a single set of factors and then work up towards adding additional factors in that interact with them, adding in additional feedbacks, etc.
Sure, like it may matter for a cohort, and then
right.
The group that makes the first move, those males are going to change their behavior
exactly.
necessarily, but their younger siblings,
right.
those yet
right.
to be born may.
It'll be a good situation. So you don't even start with an open population of people coming in over time. You start with a simple cohort type arrangement, maybe with one pathway, and then you elaborate successively. So, yeah. Okay. Good question. Any other questions on this? Yes, Kurt. Okay, thanks. Okay, lunchtime? Yep. Okay. So I haven't finished my breakfast yet. This is why it's called a boot camp, folks. Okay, so I think we've, just to sort of reflect a little bit on this morning, I've tried to convey a glimpse of some of the tools we use for agent-based modeling, talk a little bit about the context and particularly the keen nature to start simple, to build up incrementally, to think explicitly about causal pathways, and to recognize important features that go beyond the data that you have at your disposal. I'm going to end this morning's session with one particular slide here that I believe may be helpful in thinking about the sort of features to try to capture within your model. So there's a set of materials that we put on the website, and there's a slide that's called features. Let me see. I'm looking for it here. Signs of complex approach is advisable. And these are features that I want you to think about for your projects this afternoon. I've touched on many of them in the context of this morning's session. Things like emergence, presence of heterogeneity, dynamics, the fact that we see behavior over time, sometimes behavior that's not always obvious, the occurrence of delays, adaptation and learning, individual decision-making based on context. These are factors that are seen as potent motivators for use of complex systems approaches. Situations where we wish to understand the impact of changes, perhaps changes associated with policies, other interventions, or eventualities that we haven't yet observed. And we want to look for these sort of features within our situation of interest to help highlight areas in which complex systems modeling, in which this sort of agent-based modeling can lend a unique insight. Some of the sort of pathways we've just seen, these sort of pathways we saw in those other slides just a few minutes ago, some of those sorts of pathways could be captured quite nicely in statistical models. But here we really see situations where there's some distinctive characteristics where system science methods are believed to be important. Situations where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, where we can't simply reduce the behavior we see for the system as a whole into each of its pieces individually, but where instead it's an emergent interaction of a variety of different factors within our models. And here we have laid out a variety of hallmarks that a complex systems approach is needed, or agent-based modeling may be advised. And I'd ask you to think about these with respect to your problems, because there may be certain aspects of your problem where you could use a simple nonlinear regression model, where you could use a path analysis model, and come away with a great deal of insight. But these will particularly be highlighting features where they'll start cluing you into where some of the unique contributions of agent-based modeling might lie. So I'd like you to leave you with this slide. It's in your set of slides, and this afternoon we're going to be going through a little exercise where for the various projects we try to map out situations where these sorts of phenomena are manifested in each of the project areas that are being talked about, okay? So I think that's all we have time for this morning. This afternoon, we're going to be spending a lot of time hands-on building up some models first, and then going on in the final hours into to discussion of the project issues. Yes, Jeff?
Well, that slide's also Appendix B in the binder.
Thank you. Appendix B. So some people have picked up the binders. Thank you for reminding me, Jeff. There's, I think, still a box of them out there. Is that right? Oh, they're over there in the corner? Oh, okay, so there's some over there still. Okay, great. So if anyone wants to pick up a binder, it has exercise, step-by-step tutorials, challenges, the agenda, background information, the handy reference card for any logic common steps, and this slide, as well as restaurant information. Okay? Thanks very much. You can go pick it up in the background. And we'll try to keep lunch to about an hour and reconvene here just short of about 1 o'clock.